and welcome to another live chapter reading of Red's Peril Part 1, The Making of an MC Prez, which is a Satan's Devil MC Vegas chapter, Book 1, by Manda, Mellett. Chapter 1. What the fuck is this? Manny stares in disgust at the piece of paper he's just taken out of the now ripped envelope. As if he can no longer bear to touch it, he chucks it down on his desk. When he looks up, his eyes are narrowed. My shoulders rise parallel with my ears, then drop. It's self-explanatory, but seeing he clearly needs to hear it from my mouth, I oblige. My resignation. 2 weeks' notice, as required. Fuck! Disbelieving eyes meet mine, then lower as Manny picks up the discarded letter and reads it again, as if hoping this time the words would be different. Then, putting the paper to one side, he pushes his chair out from his desk and stands. Coming around to my side, he puts a grubby hand on the arms of my equally dirty overalls. Come, son, let's go get a drink. We'll discuss this. You can tell me what's on your mind. It might be considered unusual for a boss to take one of his workers to a bar in the middle of the morning, but Manny and I have a deeper relationship than normal between boss and employee. One that goes back 7 years to when I first turned up at his garage, an unskilled, only just adult begging for employment. I don't know what he'd seen in me, but after he'd completed the formal interview, one which had been entirely unsatisfactory, I'd clearly had nothing to offer. Instead of accusing me of wasting his time, he'd started to probe. Some of my desperation had gotten through to him. Manny's was the last of the dozens of places I'd already approached, and no one else had given me a chance. In many cases, there'd been no interview, and those which I'd had were over fast. But Manny had sensed there was something inside me. Instead of asking what I could offer to him, he asked the simple question, why? Once he'd learned of my home circumstances, he'd given me that chance. He hadn't gone easy on me. He'd pushed me as hard, if not harder, than anyone else would have done. But I'd repaid the faith he'd shown in me tenfold. I'd gone from sweeping floors to completing the apprenticeship he'd sponsored for me to being, though I say it myself, the #1 and best mechanic. I knew today wouldn't be easy. Of course, he'd be pissed at me for wanting to leave. But I'd also suspected it wouldn't come as a complete surprise. Removing my overalls and grabbing my jacket off the hook, I put on the warm garment, then turn up the collar. Rubbing my hands together and shivering, I step outside into the late autumn chill. Looking up at the sky, I see gray clouds brooding. Rain or snow? The latter isn't forecasted, but what do they know? It feels cold enough for the weather to turn. I grimace. I'm already running out of time. Alongside a now silent Manny, I cross the street, heading to the bar that's conveniently opposite the auto shop. I push open the door and hold it for Manny, then follow him in as we enter a different world. One that's warm and welcoming, all the elements left outside. Manny, Red, come on in. What can I get you? Being handily close, we're no strangers here. I tip my chin toward the bartender, while Manny calls out, 2 beers, Harry. Then my boss waves his hand and indicates a table in the corner. Sure, it's good for privacy, but I wonder why he's bothering. Apart from a drunk in the corner, we're the only customers at this hour. Habit, I suppose. Manny pulls out a seat and settles himself, giving out a grunt as he lowers his ass down. His knees creak, betraying his advancing age. As I take the chair opposite, he pierces me with his eyes and barely lets me get comfortable before he asks, how did the funeral go? I breathe deep and shrug. How the fuck do I answer? As well as these things can, I suppose? Yesterday I'd celebrated a life and buried a body. What more can I say? Harry arrives and places 2 beer mats and then the 2 beer bottles down. Manny takes out his wallet, but Harry shakes his head knowingly, stating, I'll start a tab. Barely waiting for the bartender to go, Manny dives straight in. You're making a mistake, son. The weight of letting down the man who's done so much for me bears down on my conscience. I didn't expect him to leap at the chance of seeing me gone, but I'd hoped he'd understand. I grimace. Done a lot of thinking, Manny. I've got no reason to hang around. He taps his fingers to a rhythm only he can hear. Is it more money? More responsibility? I can give you that. I was thinking of retiring. Manny, no. Raising my hand, I stop him. When I started, I only thought it was for a short time. You knew it was temporary. Then weeks became months, months added up to years. It's his turn to interrupt. And you've made something of yourself in the meantime. Have I? Sure, I've got a trade, a good job, and if I understand Manny correctly, a chance to take over his business and make it mine. But begging the bank for a loan and committing myself to running an auto repair shop as I ran myself into the ground trying to pay the money back sounds like a fucking millstone, and I'll be carrying around. It's not the future I'd always longed for. I became what I had to, I refute quickly. Doesn't mean it was my life's plan. Manny, you always knew I was going to move on when... My mouth twists, and I shake my head. It's hard to put into words, even now. I don't want to let you down, and fuck knows, I can't express how grateful to you I am. But I feel like I've just been motoring, stuck in the same gear, and now I've got a chance. I want to take it and move on. He stares down at his beer. Yeah, I know, son. His eyes close briefly and then reopen. I'd hoped, maybe over the years you'd found your place. I was never meant to be here, I remind him. I'd had everything planned. I was going to finish school, join the army with an eye on becoming a ranger, and travel the world. Yeah, I'd had big dreams, and had to leave them all behind. Manny shakes his head sadly. But instead, life tied you down. Fuck that bitch. He adds the last with more than a touch of malice. The bitch in question being my mother. 7 years back, I was set on the path I'd laid out for myself. Even had the papers ready and just about to sign on the dotted line when my dad had an accident at work. The building under construction had collapsed on him, breaking his back and crushing his skull. He hadn't been given long to live, his injuries considered too serious, but somehow he'd held on. He'd even recovered sufficiently to be discharged from the hospital. We'd thought we'd lost him, and it had been touch and go for a while, but he'd survive. He'd been jubilant. What kid wants to lose his dad? But as time went on, I often wondered whether he'd have preferred to have succumbed to his injuries. I'd never find out, as I'd never been able to ask. Left paralyzed from the neck down and brain damaged, he'd never come back to himself. Rather than the strong man I'd always looked up to, my dad had become nothing more than a dependent child, unable to understand the world around him and unable to communicate with it. When he neither improved nor deteriorated, his wife of 20 years, my mom, had decided caring for him hadn't been something she'd signed on for, totally forgetting the sickness part of her marriage vows. Not content with the man who'd been discharged from the hospital, she walked out, expecting me to go with her. Dad might no longer be the father I'd looked up to while growing up, but I couldn't forget deep down inside, he was still that man. A larger-than-life, always-there figure with a loud, booming voice he used to praise or admonish a growing boy. Always ready to come cheer when I was playing football or take me fishing and hunting. He taught me to drive and a myriad of other things kids looking to their dads for. But he might never be that father again. I owed him a life debt, and I was going to repay it. It was then I'd examined my relationship with my mom. She'd provided the basics, food to fill the stomach of a growing boy, a clean, tidy home to return to, but our house wasn't filled with laughter and joy, and the only things that seemed to make her happy had nothing to do with her child, and more with pleasing herself. Having not given me emotional support during my formative years, I had none to offer when she'd asked it out of me. My loyalty all for my father instead. I'd felt sadness, of course, when she'd driven away, but it was more for a loss for something I'd never had. Parental obligations meant she'd keep in touch for a while, mainly to see whether her old man was still breathing. She'd never come back. I'd had no idea what I'd been taking on. My decision made in a rush of emotion as everything became clearer and my life grew harder, of necessity. I'd shaken off the remaining shackles of childhood fast. I had nothing but hate and abhorrence left for her. Any contact petered out on her side was as well as mine. Dad had lingered far longer than expected. Years instead of the months the doctors had given him. I never regretted not doing what she suggested, putting him in a home where he'd be cared for by strangers. He needed expert care, more than I could provide. At least he had a hefty insurance payout, which enabled me to employ an experienced caregiver from 9 to 5, but little extra to live on. Hence, my job seeking, which had led me to Manny's door. No one else had wanted an 18-year-old with no experience and dying dreams of becoming a ranger. Although we could only afford part-time care, Dad had needed 24-hour attention, so that fell to me when the professional wasn't there. Alongside my mechanics training, I learned all about how to look after a man who could do nothing for himself and learned to interpret what little he could still enjoy. He knew when I was there, beamed when I returned from work and took over from the carer. He enjoyed sports, though it was unclear how much he could understand, and loved it when I filled his sippy cup with his favorite beer. Weekends, we'd both sit watching television, me on watch for checking his oxygen, that he wasn't choking, and for his diapers needing changing. In essence, I gave up my life to preserve his. I didn't resent one single minute, but no one, least of all me, expected him to last 7 years. A few weeks back, and a massive brain bleed had achieved what his accident had failed to do. I'd held his hand as he'd lain dying, a shell of a man who wasn't my dad anymore. Then, without fanfare, he faded away and was gone. For 7 years, my only reprieve had been working for Manny. Those hours working for him gave me a break which enabled me to hang on to my sanity. Manny has been good to me, but I don't owe him like I did my dad. I've had enough of giving up years when I could be building a life that I wanted, rather than one duty forced on me. It was time to be selfish and be just me. Time to seek whatever it was I was searching for. Manny wraps his fingers on the table, purses his lips, and then takes a deep breath, letting it out in a sigh. I suspected it was time when your dad went. Knew this was coming. I just hope I had something to offer you to keep you here. I'm gonna fucking miss you, Red. I'll miss you too, Manny. You know I'll never be able to thank you enough. But apart from you and this job, there's nothing here to stay for. Manny's been like a substitute father for me, and I'll never forget him. But I'm fed up with feeling I owe anyone anything. Self-centered? Perhaps. But so much of my life has been stolen. Before my dad's accident, I'd been a normal teen. Partying, getting girlfriends. I'm no 25-year-old virgin. But apart from my hand, my dick's seen no action for the past 7 years. All my free time is taken up nursing my parent. I want to let loose, make up for those missing years. I couldn't do that staying here working for Manny, or if he had his way, taking over his business. Having been forced into adulthood, I would want to take a step back, have my stab at being a wild child, live the life I'd never had. Not that I want to drift forever. Part of my dream is finding a good woman and settling down, after I've sown my wild oats, of course. And I've got a lot of those stored up. Maybe eventually having a kid and teaching it like my dad had taught me. Manny sits back, brings his bottle to his mouth, and takes a few swallows. Then replaces the empty bottle on the table, looking up with acceptance in his eyes. I won't try and talk you out of it. That wouldn't be fair. Christ, I know what you've been through since your mom walked out. So, he leans back, folding his arms. Tell me, what are your plans? Instead of the months that in the beginning I thought was all I had, I've had years to think about it, gradually revising and refining my plans. Initially, it was a delayed entry into the Army. Then, as more time passed, an acknowledgement I was too old to subject myself to that authority. Now I try to voice what my next step is. I acknowledge that even to myself, what I've mapped out sounds vague. I'm going south. I hate these winters. I want to go where I can ride my bike all year round. My mouth turns up as I nod out the window where the clouds have finally made up their minds and heavy sleet is falling. You and that fucking motorcycle of yours, he laughs. She's my pride and joy, the thing that's kept me sane over the years. I bought her cheap as a wreck and fixed her up myself. She's a thing of beauty now. An ancient Harley, but she's still got miles on her, by virtue of being almost entirely new parts. So just ride, huh? Where are you thinking? California? He doesn't tell me I'm not being sensible. Instead, there's a gleam in his eyes, as if heading out with no destination in mind is something he'd have liked to have tried. Nah, California's too crowded. I've already rejected that state. It sounds so cliche. California or Florida are the main places people tend to head for when they want to move to warmer climates. I'm just gonna head south and see where I end up. You're young. In many ways, I envy you. I know his history. Manny had settled down when he was 5 years younger than I am now. His youngest kid is my grand old age of 25. He and his wife are still happily married, but I sense an unfulfilled wanderlust in his eyes. I'll fucking miss you. He shakes his head and repeats what he'd said before. And again, it's the absolute truth when I reply, I'll miss you too, old man. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the chapter reading of Red's Peril, Part 1, The Making of an MC Prez. Have a good night.